There's a theater that never closes. Its stage is everywhere, in boardrooms and bedrooms, in family dinners and first dates, in the quiet moments before sleep, when we replay conversations and wonder what was really being said beneath the words. You are both actor and audience in this theater. Though most spend their entire lives never realizing they're performing at all. They believe the script they've memorized is who they truly are. They mistake the costume for the skin beneath. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain. Tonight, we examine why goodness, that quality we're taught to worship from childhood, so often leads to defeat. Not because goodness itself is weak, but because good people enter a game they don't know is being played. They bring sincerity to a stage built for deception. They offer trust as currency in an economy that trades in leverage. And they lose, again and again, wondering why their kindness is met with cruelty, why their honesty is weaponized against them, why the world seems designed to punish virtue and reward vice. Before we continue, a warning. The knowledge that's about to be shared cannot be unlearned. It will permanently change the way you see human relationships. If you're ready to abandon comfortable illusions and see what's behind the stage, subscribe now. Because this isn't just a video. It's the beginning of your journey under the mask. Now let us begin. Picture a woman named Sarah. She's 32 years old, works in marketing, considers herself empathetic and fair. She prides herself on seeing the best in people. When her colleague Marcus takes credit for her campaign idea in a meeting, she feels a hot flush of anger rise through her chest, feels her throat tighten with words she wants to say, but she swallows them. She tells herself that maybe Marcus didn't mean it that way. Maybe he forgot it was her idea. Maybe bringing it up would make her look petty, insecure, unable to be a team player. So she smiles. She nods. She watches her boss praise Marcus for brilliance that came from her late nights and racing thoughts in the shower and sudden 3 a.m. revelations she typed into her phone in the dark. Sarah doesn't know she's already lost. Not because she failed to speak up in that moment, though that was certainly a tactical error. She lost long before in the architecture of her beliefs about how the world works. She operates from a framework that says fairness is natural, that truth eventually surfaces, that good work speaks for itself. Marcus operates from a different framework entirely. He understands that reality is not what happens, but what people believe happens. He knows that credit flows not to those who do the work, but to those who control the narrative about the work. He's playing a game Sarah doesn't even see. This is not a story about good versus evil. That framing is itself a trap, a children's tale we tell ourselves to make sense of complexity that frightens us. Marcus is not a villain twirling a mustache. He likely sees himself as ambitious, strategic, someone who understands how the world really works. He probably justifies his actions with a dozen reasonable explanations. The idea was refined in discussion, he might think. It became something better through collaboration. And besides, in business, you have to advocate for yourself. No one else will do it for you. These thoughts come easily to him because he's never questioned the fundamental premise of his worldview, which is that life is a competition for scarce resources, status, and recognition, and the winners are those who take what they can while others hesitate. Sarah, meanwhile, carries a different operating system. She was raised, as many good people are, to believe that virtue is its own reward, that integrity matters more than outcomes, that how you play the game is more important than whether you win. These are beautiful ideas. They're the foundation of every moral philosophy and religious tradition. They're also, in the raw mechanics of human interaction, often catastrophically naive. Let's go deeper. Let's examine the anatomy of this loss, because understanding how good people lose is the first step toward understanding how they might stop losing. The game Sarah doesn't see as rules, though they're never written down. They're transmitted through culture, through observation, through the 1,000 small lessons we absorb about power and its exercise. Those who learn these rules early, either through natural inclination or harsh experience, move through the world with a fluidity that seems almost magical to those who don't understand what they're watching. Rule 1 of the invisible game is this: perception is reality. Not truth, not facts, not what actually happened in objective terms. What matters is what people believe happened, what story lodges in their minds and shapes their future decisions. Marcus understands this instinctively. When he presented Sarah's idea as his own, he wasn't just stealing credit. He was authoring reality. He was writing the story that would live in his boss's mind, in his colleagues' minds, in the organizational memory of who creates value and who merely executes. Sarah, operating from her framework of fairness, believes that truth has some inherent power to assert itself. She thinks that eventually, somehow, people will realize the idea was hers. But truth without advocacy is just noise. It's a tree falling in a forest with no one around to hear. The second rule is that power flows to those who act as if they already have it. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive principle for good people to grasp. They believe power must be earned through merit, granted by authority, justified by achievement. But watch how power actually moves in human systems. It accrues to those who speak with certainty, who take up space without apology, who make decisions as if their right to make them is unquestionable. Marcus didn't ask permission to claim Sarah's idea. He didn't hedge or qualify or express doubt. He presented it with the confidence of ownership, and that confidence itself became evidence of ownership in the minds of those watching. Sarah's hesitation, her internal debate about whether to speak up, her concern about how she might be perceived, all of this reads as uncertainty. And uncertainty is interpreted as weakness, as lack of conviction, as perhaps not really having a strong claim in the first place. The third rule is that relationships are built on exchange, not affection. Good people often confuse these two things. They believe that being kind, helpful, and supportive will naturally create bonds of loyalty and reciprocity. Sometimes this is true, but more often, what they're actually doing is training others to see them as a resource to be used rather than a player to be respected. Sarah helps her colleagues constantly. She stays late to assist with their projects. She shares her knowledge freely. She thinks this is building social capital, creating a network of goodwill that will support her when she needs it. What she's actually doing is establishing herself as someone whose time and energy are available without cost. She's teaching people that her boundaries are porous, that her needs are secondary, that she can be relied upon to sacrifice her interests for theirs. When Marcus needs someone to do the grunt work on a project he'll take credit for, who does he ask? Sarah, of course, because she's proven she'll say yes. Now, you might be feeling something uncomfortable as you read this. Perhaps a resistance, a voice saying this is too cynical, too dark, that it paints human nature in colors too bleak. That voice is worth examining. It's the voice of your own mask, the one you've worn so long you've forgotten it's there. It's the voice that wants to believe the world is fundamentally fair, that goodness is rewarded, that we live in a moral universe where justice eventually prevails. This voice is not wrong to want these things, but wanting them doesn't make them true. And confusing our wishes for reality is how we become victims of those who see clearly. Consider another scene. A man named David is in a relationship with a woman named Jennifer. David is attentive, thoughtful, emotionally available. When Jennifer is stressed, he listens for hours. When she's uncertain about her career, he helps her think through options. When she needs space, he gives it without complaint. He believes he's being a good partner, demonstrating the kind of emotional maturity and support that builds lasting intimacy. And he is doing these things. But he's also doing something else, something he doesn't realize. He's erasing himself. He's becoming a supporting character in Jennifer's story rather than the protagonist of his own. Jennifer, for her part, doesn't consciously manipulate David. She's not a calculating villain. She simply responds to the dynamic he's created. When someone consistently prioritizes your needs over their own, when they're always available, always accommodating, always understanding, something shifts in how you perceive them. They become safe, predictable, comfortable. These sound like positive qualities, and in some ways they are, but they're not the qualities that generate desire, respect, or the kind of tension that keeps a relationship vital. Jennifer finds herself thinking about her ex, Marcus. Yes, the same Marcus from before, because this is a small world and patterns repeat. Marcus was difficult. He was often unavailable. He challenged her, frustrated her, made her work for his attention. She told herself she wanted someone different, someone like David, and she does want that, in the way we want comfortable shoes or a reliable car. But want and desire are not the same thing. David senses something is wrong. Jennifer seems distant. She's less interested in sex. She's on her phone more. When he asks if everything is okay, she says yes. She's just tired, just stressed about work. He believes her because he wants to believe her, because the alternative is too threatening to his sense of how relationships work. He doubles down on his strategy. He's even more attentive, more supportive, more available. He thinks he's solving the problem. He's actually accelerating his own irrelevance. What David doesn't understand is that attraction is not a logical process. It doesn't respond to fairness or deserve or effort. It responds to perceived value, to scarcity, to the sense that someone has options and is choosing you not because they need you, but because they want you specifically. By making himself endlessly available, by having no apparent needs or boundaries or life outside of Jennifer's orbit, David has inadvertently communicated that he has low value, that he's grateful for whatever attention she gives him, that he's not someone who could easily replace her. This is not a conscious calculation on Jennifer's part. It's a deep, evolutionary response to signals about status and desirability. She's losing attraction to David not because he's too kind, but because his kindness comes without any edge, any sense of self-preservation, any indication that he values himself enough to have limits. This is where we must pause and make a crucial distinction. The game we're describing, the invisible rules that govern human interaction, these are not prescriptions for how things should be. They're descriptions of how things are. To understand the game is not to endorse it, but to refuse to understand it out of moral principle is to guarantee your defeat. This is the trap good people fall into again and again. They think that by refusing to acknowledge the darker aspects of human nature, by insisting on operating as if the world were fair and people were fundamentally trustworthy, they're taking some kind of ethical stand. What they're actually doing is unilateral disarmament. They're bringing sincerity to a knife fight and wondering why they keep getting cut. The question then becomes, can you understand the game without becoming a player who abandons all ethics? Can you see the manipulation without becoming a manipulator? Can you recognize power dynamics without becoming someone who exploits them ruthlessly? This is the razor's edge we must walk, because the alternative to naive goodness is not sociopathic self-interest. There's a third way, a path that requires more sophistication than either blind virtue or blind ambition. It requires what we might call strategic authenticity, the ability to be genuinely yourself, while also understanding the context you're operating in and adapting your approach accordingly. Let's return to Sarah. Imagine a different version of events. Marcus presents her idea in the meeting. She feels that same flush of anger, that same tightness in her throat. But instead of swallowing it, instead of telling herself stories about not being petty, she speaks, not with anger, not with accusation, but with calm clarity. She says, "I'm glad you're excited about this concept, Marcus. When I first developed it last month, I wasn't sure how it would be received. I'd love to collaborate on refining it further." Notice what she's done here. She's reclaimed ownership without making Marcus an enemy. She stated the facts while leaving him room to save face. She's demonstrated that she will not allow her contributions to be erased, but she's done so in a way that doesn't create unnecessary conflict. This is not manipulation. This is simply refusing to be manipulated. The difference is subtle but crucial. Manipulation involves deception, creating false realities to serve your interests at others' expense. Strategic authenticity involves clarity, stating truths in ways that serve your interests while respecting the complexity of the situation. Sarah's intervention is truthful. The idea was hers. She did develop it last month, but she's framed this truth in a way that protects her interests, establishes her boundaries, and maintains the relationship. She's playing the game, but she's playing it with integrity. Now imagine David in his relationship with Jennifer. He notices her distance. Instead of becoming more accommodating, he pulls back slightly, not as a manipulation, not as some calculated strategy to make her jealous, but because he genuinely reconnects with his own life, his own interests, his own sense of self that's been eroding. He starts going to the gym again. He reconnects with friends he's been neglecting. He takes on a project at work that excites him. When Jennifer asks why he's been less available, he's honest. He says he realized he'd been losing himself a bit. making the relationship his entire world, and he needs to maintain balance. He says this not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of self-awareness. What happens next is interesting. Jennifer's attraction begins to return, not because David is playing games, but because he stopped playing the game of self-erasure. He's become, once again, a person with his own gravity, his own center, his own life that she's invited into rather than someone who exists in orbit around her. This is the paradox that good people struggle to understand. The way to maintain connection is not to dissolve your boundaries, but to maintain them. The way to be loved is not to make yourself endlessly available, but to be someone worth pursuing. The way to be respected is not to never assert yourself, but to assert yourself with such consistency that others learn where your lines are and adjust accordingly. But let's not pretend this is easy. Let's not pretend that once you see the game, playing it with integrity becomes simple. Because there's a deeper problem we haven't yet addressed. The reason good people lose isn't just that they don't understand the rules. It's that the rules themselves conflict with their deepest sense of who they are. To play the game, even with integrity, requires a kind of self-awareness that can be painful. It requires acknowledging that you have self-interest, that you care about status and recognition and power, that you're not purely motivated by altruism and fairness. It requires integrating what Carl Jung called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've been taught to deny and repress. Sarah was raised to be nice. Not kind, which is different, but nice. Nice means not making waves, not causing discomfort, not asserting yourself in ways that might create conflict. Nice is a cage built from the expectations of others, and Sarah has lived in that cage so long she's forgotten it's there. When Marcus took credit for her idea, her anger wasn't just about the injustice. It was about the fact that responding to the injustice would require her to be not nice. It would require her to risk being seen as difficult, aggressive, not a team player. These labels terrify her more than the loss of credit because they threaten her identity, her sense of who she's supposed to be. This is the real game, the one beneath the surface moves and counter-moves. It's the game we play with ourselves, the negotiation between who we've been taught to be and who we actually are. Good people lose because they've internalized rules that make them lose. They've accepted a moral framework that treats self-advocacy as selfishness, boundary setting as cruelty, strategic thinking as manipulation. They've been taught that virtue means self-sacrifice, that goodness requires making yourself small, that the highest moral achievement is to have no needs, no ego, no self-interest. And then they're shocked when the world treats them accordingly, when they're used and discarded and overlooked, when their goodness is taken for granted rather than rewarded. The people who win, the Marcus types, they never accepted these rules, or they accepted them only as public performance, as a mask to wear when useful. Privately, they operate from a different code. They understand that the world is not a moral universe, but a neutral one, that outcomes are determined not by virtue, but by strategy, that power goes to those who take it rather than those who deserve it. This doesn't make them evil. It makes them realistic. The question is whether you can be realistic without becoming ruthless, whether you can see clearly without losing your humanity. Consider a third character. His name is Robert, and he's a manager at a mid-sized tech company. Robert is facing a decision. His team has been working on a project for 6 months. It's behind schedule and over budget. His boss is asking questions. Robert knows that the delays are partly his fault. He approved a technical approach that turned out to be more complex than anticipated. He also knows that if he frames the situation correctly, he can shift blame to his team, to market conditions, to factors outside his control. No one would be able to prove otherwise. The facts are ambiguous enough that multiple narratives are possible. The old Robert, the good person Robert, would have taken responsibility. He would have believed that honesty was the right approach, that admitting mistakes builds trust, that integrity matters more than self-protection. And there's truth in all of that. But the old Robert also got passed over for promotion twice, while watching colleagues who were better at managing up, at controlling narratives, at taking credit and deflecting blame, advance past him. The old Robert is tired of losing. So Robert does something that makes his stomach tight with discomfort. He presents the situation to his boss in a way that's not technically dishonest, but is strategically framed. He emphasizes the external challenges, the team's learning curve, the complexity that no one could have foreseen. He doesn't lie, but he shapes the truth, sculpts it into a form that protects him. And it works. His boss is understanding, even sympathetic. The project gets extended. Robert's reputation remains intact. He feels relief, but he also feels something else. A kind of shame, a sense that he's crossed a line, that he's become someone he didn't want to be. This is the moment of transformation, the point where good people either retreat back into their comfortable illusions or push forward into a more complex understanding of morality. Robert is experiencing what happens when you start playing the game. You win, but the winning doesn't feel the way you thought it would. It doesn't feel clean. It doesn't feel like virtue rewarded. It feels like compromise, like you've traded a piece of your soul for a piece of security. And maybe you have. Or maybe what you've actually done is recognized that the soul you thought you had, the perfectly virtuous self you believed you were, was itself a kind of mask, a story you told yourself to avoid confronting the messy reality of human motivation. Jung wrote about the persona, the mask we wear for the world, and the shadow, everything we've repressed and denied about ourselves. He argued that psychological health requires integrating the shadow, acknowledging and accepting the parts of ourselves we've been taught to reject. For good people, the shadow often contains their ambition, their anger, their capacity for strategic thinking and self-interest. They've been taught these qualities are bad, so they've pushed them down, pretended they don't exist. But repression doesn't eliminate these qualities. It just makes them unconscious, which means they leak out in ways we don't control or recognize. Sarah's resentment toward Marcus, David's growing bitterness toward Jennifer, Robert's shame about protecting himself. These are all shadow material trying to surface. The emotions are signals that something is wrong, not with the world, but with how they're navigating it. Their goodness has become a prison, and the bars are made of their own unexamined beliefs about what it means to be a moral person. Let's examine what happens when good people begin to wake up, when they start to see the game and decide they want to play. There are typically 3 paths they take, and only one of them leads to genuine integration and power. The first path is what we might call the dark awakening. This is when someone like Robert decides that if the world is immoral, then he will be too. He swings from naive goodness to cynical self-interest. He becomes what he once despised, justifying it with the logic that everyone else is doing it, that he was a fool to ever believe otherwise, that morality is just a story the powerful tell to keep the weak compliant. This path leads to short-term gains and long-term emptiness. Robert might advance in his career, but he'll lose something essential in the process. He'll become hollow, performing success, while feeling increasingly disconnected from any sense of meaning or purpose. The second path is retreat. This is when the cognitive dissonance becomes too much, when the gap between how the world actually works and how good people believe it should work becomes unbearable. They withdraw. They tell themselves they're too good for the game, that they'd rather lose with integrity than win through compromise. They cultivate a kind of bitter superiority, a sense that they're morally elevated precisely because they refuse to engage with the messy realities of power. This path leads to stagnation and resentment. Sarah might stay in her role, never advancing, telling herself she's above office politics while secretly seething at those who aren't. David might end his relationship with Jennifer and seek someone who appreciates his goodness, but he'll likely recreate the same dynamic because he hasn't addressed the underlying pattern. The third path is integration. This is the hardest path because it requires holding 2 seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. It requires accepting that the world is not fair while still choosing to act with integrity. It requires understanding the game while refusing to let the game define your values. It requires developing what we might call ethical sophistication, the ability to be strategic without being manipulative, to protect your interests without exploiting others, to see clearly without becoming cynical. What does this look like in practice? Let's imagine Sarah 5 years later. She's now a director at a different company. She's learned to advocate for herself, to frame her contributions in ways that ensure they're recognized, to build alliances strategically. But she's also maintained her core values. She mentors junior employees, not just as a performance of goodness, but because she genuinely wants to help them avoid the mistakes she made. She's direct in her communication, setting clear boundaries and expectations. When someone tries to take credit for her work, she addresses it immediately, calmly, and publicly. She's developed a reputation as someone who is both collaborative and formidable, someone you want on your team but don't want to cross. The key difference between this version of Sarah and Marcus is intentionality. Marcus operates from unconscious patterns of self-interest. He takes credit, manages up, and plays politics because that's simply how he moves through the world. He's never examined whether this is who he wants to be or considered the costs of his approach. Sarah, by contrast, has done the hard work of integration. She's looked at her shadow, acknowledged her ambition and her capacity for strategic thinking, and chosen to develop these qualities consciously and ethically. She plays the game, but she plays it on her terms, with full awareness of what she's doing and why. David's integration looks different. He's learned that love is not about self-sacrifice, but about two whole people choosing each other. He's in a new relationship, but this time he maintains his boundaries from the beginning. He's attentive and caring, but he also has his own life, his own interests, his own non-negotiable needs. When his partner asks for something that would require him to abandon his own priorities, he says no without guilt or extensive justification. Just a simple, clear no. This doesn't make him selfish. It makes him someone with a self, someone who can be in relationship without disappearing into it. His partner respects him more, not less, for this. The relationship has tension, disagreements, moments of friction, but it also has vitality, mutual respect, and the kind of depth that only comes when two people are fully present rather than one person performing and the other consuming. Robert's path is perhaps the most complex. He's still a manager, now at a senior level. He's learned to navigate organizational politics, to build coalitions, to frame situations in ways that serve his interests. But he's also developed a personal code, a set of lines he won't cross. He won't lie, though he will strategically emphasize certain truths over others. He won't throw his team under the bus, though he will hold them accountable and expect them to hold him accountable in return. He won't take credit for others' work, though he will ensure his contributions are visible and valued. He's learned that you can be strategic without being unethical, that you can protect yourself without harming others, that you can play the game while still sleeping well at night. These three characters represent different aspects of the same journey, the movement from naive goodness to strategic integrity. But let's be clear about something. This journey is not about becoming a better person in some abstract moral sense. It's about becoming a more effective person, someone who can achieve their goals and protect their interests while maintaining their values. The world doesn't reward goodness. It rewards competence, clarity, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics. Good people who develop these skills don't stop being good. They become good people who win. But there's a shadow side to this awakening that we must address. Once you see the game, once you understand how manipulation works, how power flows, how narratives are constructed and reality is shaped, you can't unsee it. You start noticing it everywhere. You see it in your friendships, your family relationships, your romantic partnerships. You see how your mother uses guilt to control, how your friend uses vulnerability to manipulate, how your partner uses affection as a reward for compliance. You see the masks everyone wears, the performances everyone gives, the games everyone plays, whether they know it or not. And this knowledge can be isolating. It can make you feel like you're watching a play where everyone else thinks they're living real life. This is the burden of awareness. Once you understand the mechanics of human interaction at this level, genuine connection becomes both more difficult and more precious. You're constantly analyzing, constantly aware of the subtext, constantly wondering what's real and what's performance. This is why integration is so important. If you simply become cynical, if you decide that everything is manipulation and everyone is playing games, you'll lose the capacity for authentic connection. You'll become the thing you once feared, someone who sees relationships purely as transactions, who can't trust or be vulnerable because you're too busy calculating angles and protecting yourself. The solution is not to stop seeing the game, but to develop what we might call dual consciousness. This is the ability to be aware of the strategic level of interaction while also being present to the human level. You can notice that your friend is using a particular conversational technique to steer the discussion toward asking you for a favor. And you can also genuinely care about your friend and want to help them if you're able. You can recognize that your partner is testing your boundaries to see how much they can get away with. And you can also love your partner and understand that this testing is a normal part of how humans figure out relationship dynamics. The game and the genuine coexist. They always have. The difference is that now you're aware of both levels instead of just one. This dual consciousness is what separates the integrated person from both the naive good person and the cynical game player. The naive person sees only the surface, takes everything at face value, and gets exploited. The cynical person sees only the game, reduces everything to strategy, and loses their humanity. The integrated person sees both and chooses consciously how to engage with each situation. Sometimes they play the game. Sometimes they choose vulnerability and authenticity even when it's strategically suboptimal. The key is that it's a choice, made with full awareness, rather than a default pattern running unconsciously. Let's explore a specific scenario to illustrate this dual consciousness in action. Imagine Sarah is now interviewing for a C-suite position. She's in the final round, competing against two other candidates. One of them is Marcus, yes, the same Marcus, because patterns repeat and the universe has a sense of irony. The interview is with the CEO and the board. Sarah knows this is not just about her qualifications. Everyone at this level is qualified. This is about presence, about narrative, about who can project the kind of authority and vision that makes people want to follow. The old Sarah would have prepared by focusing on her accomplishments, her track record, her plans for the role. She would have been honest, thorough, and competent. She also would have been forgettable. The new Sarah understands that she needs to do something different. She needs to tell a story, not just present facts. She needs to create an emotional experience, not just convey information. She needs to demonstrate power, not just competence. So she does her research. She learns everything she can about the board members, their backgrounds, their priorities, their fears. She identifies the key challenge the company is facing, the thing that keeps the CEO up at night. And she crafts her presentation not as a recitation of her qualifications, but as a narrative about transformation, about how she's uniquely positioned to lead the company through this challenge because she's already done something similar in a different context. She uses specific stories, vivid details, moments that create pictures in the listener's minds. She speaks with certainty, not arrogance, but the kind of calm confidence that comes from someone who knows their value and doesn't need external validation. But here's the crucial part. Sarah is not being fake. She's not pretending to be someone she's not. Everything she says is true. The stories are real. The confidence is genuine, earned through years of work and growth. What she's doing is strategic authenticity. She's choosing which truths to emphasize, how to frame them, when to pause for effect, how to modulate her voice and body language to create the desired impact. She's performing, yes, but she's performing a version of herself that's real, just amplified and focused. Marcus, by contrast, is also performing, but his performance is less conscious. He's doing what's always worked for him, projecting confidence, making bold claims, telling the board what he thinks they want to hear. He's good at this. He's been doing it his whole career. But there's a hollowness to it that some people can sense, a feeling that you're watching a very polished presentation rather than connecting with a human being. The board is impressed, but they're not moved. Sarah gets the job, not because she's more qualified than Marcus, though she is. Not because she's more ethical, though she is. She gets the job because she's learned to play the game at a level Marcus never had to reach. Marcus has been winning on natural talent and unconscious strategy his whole life. He never had to develop the kind of deep self-awareness and intentional skill that Sarah has cultivated through years of losing and learning. His advantage has become his limitation. He's peaked. Sarah is still evolving. This is the paradox of the game. Those who win easily early often lose later because they never develop depth. They never have to examine their patterns, question their assumptions, or grow beyond their default strategies. Those who struggle early, who lose and feel the pain of losing, who are forced to understand why they're losing and what they need to change, They're the ones who ultimately develop the most sophisticated and sustainable approach to power. Their losses become their education. Their pain becomes their wisdom. But let's not romanticize this process. Let's not pretend that losing is somehow better than winning. That struggle is inherently noble. Losing hurts. Being exploited hurts. Watching less ethical people succeed while you flounder hurts. The question is what you do with that hurt. Do you let it make you bitter and cynical? Do you use it as an excuse to abandon your values? Or do you let it teach you? Let it show you where your blind spots are. Let it motivate you to develop new skills and new ways of being in the world. Sarah's journey from the woman who let Marcus take credit to the executive who beats him for a C-suite role is not a story of becoming more ruthless. It's a story of becoming more conscious. She didn't abandon her values. She expanded her capabilities. She didn't become manipulative. She became strategic. She didn't lose her goodness. She learned to protect it, to advocate for it, to ensure that her goodness could actually have impact in the world rather than just making her feel virtuous while she remained powerless. This distinction is critical. There's a version of this awakening that leads to people becoming what they once despised. They learn about manipulation and become manipulators. They learn about power and become power-hungry. They learn about the game and lose themselves in it. This is not integration. This is just swapping one unconscious pattern for another. True integration means developing new capabilities while maintaining your core values. It means learning to be strategic without becoming cynical, learning to protect yourself without becoming paranoid, learning to see the game without letting the game consume you. Now let's talk about the masks themselves, because this is where the metaphor becomes most useful. Everyone wears masks. This is not a moral judgment. It's a psychological fact. We present different versions of ourselves in different contexts. You're not the same person with your boss as you are with your best friend. Not the same with your parents as you are with your partner. These aren't lies. They're adaptations, appropriate responses to different social contexts and relationships. The mask becomes a problem only when you forget you're wearing it, when you mistake the performance for the reality, when you lose touch with who you are beneath all the roles you play. Good people often have a particular kind of mask, what we might call the mask of virtue. This is the face they show the world that says, I am kind, I am fair, I am selfless, I am good. And they believe this mask is their true face. They've worn it so long, been rewarded for wearing it in certain contexts, that they've forgotten it's a construction. Beneath this mask is a more complex reality. There's ambition, anger, selfishness, pettiness, all the normal human qualities that don't fit the virtuous self-image. But because these qualities are incompatible with the mask, they get pushed down, denied, projected onto others. This is why good people are often shocked when they feel intense anger or jealousy or vindictiveness. They think these feelings mean something is wrong with them, that they're not actually good after all. But the feelings aren't the problem. The problem is the mask that says good people don't have these feelings. The problem is the belief that virtue means the absence of shadow rather than the conscious integration of it. When Sarah felt rage at Marcus for taking credit for her work, that rage was healthy. It was her psyche telling her that a boundary had been violated, that she needed to act. The problem wasn't the rage. The problem was that her mask of niceness told her the rage was inappropriate, that good people don't make scenes, that she should swallow it and smile. The people who win at the game, the Marcus types, they often have a different relationship with their masks. They know they're performing. They might not articulate it this way, might not be fully conscious of it, but at some level they understand that the face they show the world is strategic, designed to get them what they want. Their mask says, I am confident, I am competent, I am someone you should follow. Beneath this mask might be insecurity, doubt, fear of inadequacy. But they've learned to keep the mask in place, to never let the uncertainty show. This gives them a certain kind of power, but it also creates a fragility. Their entire sense of self is built on the performance. If the mask cracks, if people see the insecurity beneath, the whole structure collapses. The integrated person has a different relationship with masks. They know they're wearing them. They choose which mask to wear in which context. But they also maintain connection with who they are beneath the masks. They can perform confidence in a job interview while also acknowledging to themselves that they're nervous. They can present a polished professional image, while also staying in touch with their doubts and vulnerabilities. The mask is a tool, not an identity. This creates a kind of stability that neither the naive good person nor the unconscious game player has. The good person is fragile because their self-image depends on maintaining the illusion of virtue. The game player is fragile because their self-worth depends on the performance succeeding. The integrated person is stable because they know who they are independent of any particular mask or performance. Let's examine a specific mask in detail, one that's particularly relevant to understanding why good people lose. This is the mask of the helper, the caretaker, the person who's always there for others. This mask is worn by many good people, and it's particularly insidious because it feels so virtuous. How could there be anything wrong with helping people, with being supportive and caring? But look beneath the mask, and you often find something more complex. You find someone who's learned that their value comes from being useful, that love is conditional on service, that the only way to ensure people stay in their life is to make themselves indispensable. David wore this mask in his relationship with Jennifer. He helped her, supported her, made himself available for her needs. On the surface, this looked like love. Beneath the surface, it was a strategy, though not a conscious one. It was a way of managing his own anxiety about being abandoned, about not being enough. If he could just be helpful enough, supportive enough, understanding enough, then Jennifer would have to stay, would have to love him. But this strategy backfired, as it always does, because it created exactly the dynamic he feared. By making his value contingent on his usefulness, he trained Jennifer to see him as a resource rather than a partner. By having no needs of his own, he became someone with no substance, no center, no there. The helper mask is particularly common among women, who are socialized from childhood to be caretakers, to put others' needs before their own, to derive their sense of worth from how well they serve. But men wear it too, often in different forms. The provider, the protector, the problem solver. These are all versions of the helper mask, and they all create the same fundamental problem. They make your value extrinsic rather than intrinsic. Your worth comes from what you do for others rather than from who you are. This makes you vulnerable to exploitation, to being used and discarded once you're no longer useful, to burning out from the endless demand to give without receiving. The integrated person can help others without wearing the helper mask. They can be generous, supportive, caring, but from a place of choice rather than compulsion. They help because they want to, because it aligns with their values, because it brings them genuine satisfaction. But they also know when to say no, when to prioritize their own needs, when to let others struggle with their own problems. They understand that real help often means not helping, means allowing people to develop their own capacity rather than creating dependency. They know that the best gift you can give someone is not to solve their problems, but to believe in their ability to solve their own problems. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the game that good people often miss. The game is not just about individual interactions. It's about systems, about patterns that repeat across contexts and relationships. When you start to see the game, you start to see these patterns everywhere. You see how families create roles that people get locked into, how organizations develop cultures that reward certain behaviors and punish others, how societies construct narratives about success and failure, worthiness and unworthiness, that serve the interests of those in power. Sarah's awakening wasn't just about learning to deal with Marcus. It was about recognizing that the Marcus situation was part of a larger pattern, a system that rewards self-promotion over competence, confidence over humility, strategic narrative over honest work. Once she saw this pattern, she could see it operating everywhere. She could see how her company's culture tacitly encouraged taking credit and discouraged collaboration. She could see how the metrics used to evaluate performance were easily gained by those who understood what was being measured versus what was actually valuable. She could see how the people who advanced were not necessarily the best at their jobs, but the best at managing perceptions about their jobs. This systemic awareness is both empowering and overwhelming. It's empowering because once you see the system, you can work with it or around it rather than being blindly subject to it. It's overwhelming because you realize how pervasive these patterns are. How much of what you thought was natural or inevitable is actually constructed and maintained by human choices? You start to question everything. Is your relationship genuine, or just a pattern you're both unconsciously repeating? Is your career path something you chose, or something that was chosen for you by a system that benefits from your particular skills and temperament? Is your sense of self authentic, or just an internalization of others' expectations and projections? These questions can lead to a kind of existential crisis, a feeling that nothing is real, that everything is performance and manipulation and game playing. This is a dangerous moment in the awakening process. This is where people either retreat back into comfortable illusions or push through to a more mature understanding. The mature understanding is this: yes, everything is constructed. Yes, we're all playing roles and wearing masks and operating within systems we didn't create. And also, within all of that, there is still genuine connection, real love, authentic meaning. The game and the genuine are not mutually exclusive. They're different levels of the same reality. Think of it like watching a movie. You know it's not real. You know the actors are performing, that the emotions are scripted, that the whole thing is a construction designed to manipulate your feelings. And yet, if it's a good movie, you cry. You laugh. You feel genuine emotion. The fact that it's constructed doesn't make the emotion less real. It just means you're aware of both levels simultaneously, the construction and the experience. This is the dual consciousness we talked about earlier. You can know that your partner is using certain conversational techniques, perhaps unconsciously, to get you to agree to something, and you can also genuinely love your partner and feel moved by their vulnerability in asking. Both are true. Both are real. The key is not to eliminate the game, but to play it consciously and ethically. This means developing what we might call strategic wisdom, the ability to navigate complex social dynamics while maintaining your integrity. Strategic wisdom has several components. First, it requires accurate perception. You need to see what's actually happening, not what you wish were happening or what you've been told is happening. This means overcoming your biases, your projections, your tendency to see what you expect to see. It means being willing to accept uncomfortable truths about people you care about systems you're invested in, about yourself. Second, strategic wisdom requires emotional regulation. When you see manipulation, exploitation, or injustice, you'll feel anger. When you recognize your own complicity in patterns that harm you, you'll feel shame. When you realize how much of your life has been spent playing a game you didn't know existed, you'll feel grief. These emotions are valid and important, but they can't drive your decisions. You need to feel them, process them, learn from them, and then act from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. This is perhaps the hardest skill to develop, because our culture teaches us either to suppress emotions or to be ruled by them. Strategic wisdom requires a third way: feeling fully while thinking clearly. Third, strategic wisdom requires ethical grounding. This is what separates strategic wisdom from mere cunning or manipulation. You need to know what you stand for, what lines you won't cross, what kind of person you want to be. These values can't be abstract principles you've inherited from others. They need to be deeply felt, personally chosen, tested through experience. Sarah's values evolved through her journey. She started with inherited beliefs about niceness and fairness. She developed, through painful experience, a more sophisticated ethical framework that included self-advocacy, strategic thinking, and boundary setting while still maintaining her core commitment to integrity and genuine care for others. Fourth, strategic wisdom requires adaptability. The game changes depending on context. What works in a corporate environment doesn't work in a romantic relationship. What works with one person doesn't work with another. You need to be able to read situations accurately and adjust your approach accordingly. This doesn't mean being fake or inconsistent. It means recognizing that different contexts call for different aspects of yourself to come forward. You can be assertive in a negotiation and vulnerable in an intimate conversation. You can be strategic in your career and spontaneous in your friendships. The key is that you're choosing consciously rather than defaulting to one mode regardless of context. Fifth, strategic wisdom requires patience. The game is long. Individual wins and losses matter less than the overall trajectory. Sometimes the strategic move is to let someone take credit, to lose a battle in order to win a war, to appear weak when you're actually strong. This kind of patience is difficult for good people who've been taught that virtue should be immediately rewarded. They want fairness now, recognition now, justice now. But power accumulates slowly, through consistent choices over time, through building reputation and relationships and skills that compound. The people who win in the long term are not necessarily those who win every individual interaction, but those who understand the larger game and play it with consistency and discipline. Let's return to our characters one final time and see where their journeys have led them. Sarah is now a CEO. She's built a company culture that rewards both competence and integrity. She's created systems that make it harder to game the metrics, that value collaboration over self-promotion, that recognize and develop talent rather than just rewarding those who are good at managing up. But she's also realistic. She knows that even with the best systems, human nature will find ways to play games. So she stays vigilant. She watches for patterns. She addresses problems early before they become entrenched. She models the behavior she wants to see, being both strategic and authentic, both ambitious and ethical. David is in a long-term relationship that's evolved into a marriage. He and his partner have their struggles, their conflicts, their moments of disconnection. But they've built something real, something that can withstand the inevitable challenges, because it's based on two whole people choosing each other rather than one person disappearing into the other. David has learned that love is not about sacrifice, but about mutual growth. Not about having no needs, but about negotiating needs honestly. Not about never disappointing each other, but about repairing ruptures when they happen. He's learned that the goal is not to find someone who completes you, but to be complete yourself, and then share that completeness with another complete person. Robert has left the corporate world. He realized that no matter how ethically he played the game itself was fundamentally at odds with what he valued. So he started his own consulting practice, working with organizations that genuinely want to change, that are willing to examine their cultures and systems and make them more humane. He makes less money than he did as a senior executive, but he sleeps better. He's found a way to use his strategic skills in service of values he believes in. He's learned that sometimes the most strategic move is to change the game rather than just playing it better. These outcomes are not meant to be prescriptive. Your journey will be different. The specific choices that make sense for you will depend on your context, your values, your temperament, your goals. The point is not that there's one right way to integrate the shadow and play the game ethically. The point is that integration is possible, that you don't have to choose between being good and being effective, between having integrity and having power, between seeing clearly and maintaining your humanity. But let's be honest about the costs. This journey of awakening and integration is not easy. It requires you to question everything you've been taught about goodness, success, relationships, and power. It requires you to look at your own shadow, to acknowledge the parts of yourself you've been denying. It requires you to accept that the world is not fair, that virtue is not always rewarded, that sometimes bad things happen to good people not because of some cosmic injustice, but simply because good people don't know how to protect themselves. It requires you to develop skills that might feel uncomfortable or inauthentic at first, to practice strategic thinking and self-advocacy and boundary setting until they become natural. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood, of being seen as difficult or aggressive or not nice when you start asserting yourself. And perhaps most difficult of all, it requires you to accept that you can't save everyone. You can't make the world fair through your individual goodness. You can't fix broken systems by being a good person within them. You can't love someone into health or help someone into growth if they're not willing to do their own work. This acceptance is painful for good people, who often have a savior complex, a belief that if they just try hard enough, care enough, give enough, they can make things right. But this belief is itself a kind of narcissism, an inflation of your own power and importance. The truth is that you're responsible for yourself, your choices, your growth. You can influence others, support them, create conditions that make their growth more likely, but you can't do it for them. And trying to do so often just creates codependency and resentment. So what does it mean to be a good person who wins? It means being someone who understands the game well enough to play it effectively while maintaining clear ethical boundaries. It means being strategic without being manipulative, ambitious without being ruthless, self-interested without being selfish. It means knowing when to compete and when to collaborate, when to assert and when to yield, when to speak and when to listen. It means developing the kind of social intelligence that allows you to read situations accurately and respond appropriately. It means building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than on neediness or exploitation. It means accepting that you will sometimes be misunderstood, that not everyone will like you, that standing up for yourself will sometimes create conflict. It means being willing to be seen as difficult or demanding or not nice when you're actually just being clear about your needs and boundaries. It means understanding that people who benefit from your self-sacrifice will often frame your self-advocacy as selfishness, and being okay with that. It means knowing the difference between being kind and being nice, between being compassionate and being a doormat, between being generous and being exploited. It means developing what the Stoics called the dichotomy of control, the ability to distinguish between what you can control and what you can't. You can control your actions, your responses, your choices. You can't control how others perceive you, whether they appreciate your efforts, whether they reciprocate your care. You can influence these things, but you can't control them. And trying to control them, trying to manage others' perceptions and feelings through your behavior, is itself a form of manipulation, even when it comes from good intentions. The integrated person acts from their values and accepts whatever consequences follow, rather than trying to engineer specific outcomes through strategic self-presentation. But wait, you might be thinking, isn't this just another form of the game? Isn't strategic authenticity just manipulation with better branding? This is a fair question, and it gets at something important. The line between strategic authenticity and manipulation can be thin. The difference lies in intention and impact. Manipulation involves deception, creating false realities to serve your interests at others' expense. Strategic authenticity involves clarity, presenting genuine aspects of yourself in ways that serve your interests while respecting others' autonomy and well-being. Manipulation diminishes others. Strategic authenticity empowers both yourself and others by creating clear, honest interactions where everyone knows where they stand. Consider the difference between Sarah's intervention when Marcus took credit for her idea and a manipulative response. A manipulative response might have been to privately undermine Marcus, to spread rumors about his competence, to sabotage his projects while maintaining a friendly facade. This would have been deceptive, harmful, and ultimately corrosive to Sarah's own integrity. What Sarah actually did was state the truth clearly and publicly, reclaiming her contribution while leaving Marcus room to save face. This served her interests, yes, but it didn't harm Marcus beyond the natural consequence of his own actions being exposed. It was honest, direct, and ultimately more respectful than either silent acceptance or covert retaliation. Or consider David's choice to pull back and reconnect with his own life when he noticed Jennifer's distance. A manipulative approach would have been to deliberately make Jennifer jealous, to flirt with other women or talk about how much interest he's getting, to use withdrawal as a punishment or a tool to make her chase him. What David actually did was genuinely reconnect with aspects of his life he'd been neglecting, not as a strategy to win Jennifer back, but as a recognition that he'd lost himself and needed to find himself again. The fact that this also made him more attractive to Jennifer was a side effect, not the primary goal. His actions were authentic, serving his genuine need for balance and self-connection, even though they also happened to be strategically effective. This distinction matters because it's the difference between using these insights to become more fully yourself versus using them to become a more sophisticated manipulator. The former leads to integration and genuine power. The latter leads to hollowness and eventual collapse. You can fool others for a while with sophisticated manipulation, but you can't fool yourself. At some level, you know when you're being authentic and when you're performing. You know when your actions align with your values and when you're compromising yourself for short-term gain. And that knowledge, that internal sense of integrity or its absence, shapes everything about how you experience your life and relationships. The integrated person has what we might call internal congruence. Their public self and private self are aligned. They might emphasize different aspects of themselves in different contexts, but there's no fundamental split between who they are and who they present themselves to be. This creates a kind of ease and confidence that can't be faked. It's the difference between someone who's comfortable in their own skin and someone who's constantly monitoring and adjusting their performance. People can sense this difference, even if they can't articulate it. It's why authentic confidence is so much more attractive than performed confidence. Why genuine kindness is so much more impactful than strategic niceness. Now let's address something that might be troubling you as you read this. You might be thinking about someone in your life who seems to embody everything we've been criticizing. Someone who plays games, who manipulates, who takes advantage of good people. And you might be wondering, if they're winning and good people are losing, doesn't that mean the world rewards bad behavior? Doesn't that mean we should all become more like them? This is the dark temptation, the siren song that leads good people to abandon their values in pursuit of success. But here's what you need to understand. The Marcus types, the people who win through unconscious manipulation and strategic self-interest, they're not actually winning in any deep sense. They're accumulating external markers of success, money, status, power, but they're often profoundly disconnected from themselves and others. They have relationships, but not intimacy. They have achievements, but not fulfillment. They have power, but not peace. They're running on a treadmill, constantly needing more validation, more success, more proof of their worth, because they have no internal sense of value independent of external achievement. This is not to say they're suffering in some obvious way. Many of them seem perfectly happy, at least on the surface. But talk to them in unguarded moments, or watch what happens when the external validation stops flowing, when they lose their job or their relationship or their status, and you'll see the fragility beneath the confidence. You'll see how much of their identity is built on sand, how little they actually know themselves, how terrified they are of being ordinary or invisible or not special. Their success is real, but it's also hollow. It doesn't nourish them. It just temporarily quiets the anxiety that drives them. The integrated person, by contrast, has a different relationship with success. They want it. They work for it. They're strategic in pursuing it. But their sense of self is not dependent on it. They can fail without falling apart. They can succeed without becoming inflated. They can be ordinary without feeling diminished. This internal stability is the real prize, the thing that makes all the work of integration worthwhile. It's what allows you to play the game without being consumed by it, to pursue power without being corrupted by it, to see clearly without becoming cynical. But achieving this stability requires something that's deeply countercultural. It requires you to stop seeking external validation as your primary source of worth. It requires you to develop an internal locus of evaluation, a sense of your own value that's independent of what others think or how you compare to others. This is extraordinarily difficult in a culture that's constantly telling you that your worth is determined by your achievements, your appearance, your status, your ability to perform and compete and win. It requires you to step off the treadmill, to stop playing the comparison game, to find meaning and value in things that can't be measured or ranked or posted on social media. For Sarah, this meant recognizing that her worth was not determined by whether she got credit for her ideas or advanced in her career. Those things mattered. She wanted them. She worked for them. But they didn't define her. She was valuable because she was a conscious, creative, caring human being, because she was doing her best to live with integrity and grow through her challenges. This internal sense of worth gave her the stability to advocate for herself without desperation, to take risks without being reckless, to fail without being destroyed. It's what allowed her to eventually become a CEO who could lead with both strength and compassion, because she wasn't using her position to prove her worth. She already knew her worth. The position was just a platform to express it. For David, it meant understanding that his value was not determined by whether Jennifer or anyone else loved him. He was worthy of love not because he was useful or accommodating or perfect, but simply because he was human, because he had depth and complexity and the capacity for genuine connection. This freed him to be in relationship without losing himself, to love without needing to control the outcome, to be vulnerable without being desperate. It's what allowed him to eventually build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than on his need to be needed. For Robert, it meant recognizing that his worth was not determined by his title or salary or position in the corporate hierarchy. He was valuable because of his skills, his integrity, his commitment to doing work that mattered. This gave him the freedom to leave a system that was fundamentally at odds with his values, to take the risk of starting his own practice, to define success on his own terms rather than accepting the definitions imposed by others. It's what allowed him to build a career that was both successful and meaningful, that served his values rather than compromising them. This internal stability, this sense of worth that's independent of external validation, is the foundation of genuine power. Not power over others, which is what most people think of when they hear the word power, but power too, the capacity to act effectively in the world, to create the life you want, to influence your circumstances rather than being passively shaped by them. This kind of power doesn't come from dominating others, or winning competitions, or accumulating status. It comes from self-knowledge, from clarity about your values and priorities, from the courage to act in alignment with who you are even when it's difficult or unpopular. And here's the paradox. When you stop seeking external validation, when you develop this internal stability and genuine power, you often end up getting more external validation than you did when you were desperately seeking it. People are drawn to those who are comfortable in their own skin, who don't need anything from them, who are simply present and authentic. This is why the integrated person often ends up more successful in conventional terms than either the naive good person or the unconscious game player. They have the strategic skills of the game player without the hollowness. They have the integrity of the good person without the naivety. They're playing a different game entirely, one where the goal is not to win at others' expense, but to create value, build genuine relationships, and live in alignment with their deepest values. But let's be clear. This is not a guaranteed path to conventional success. You might do all this work, develop all these skills, integrate your shadow, and play the game with strategic authenticity, and still not become a CEO, or find your perfect partner, or achieve whatever external markers of success you're pursuing. The world is complex. Luck matters. Timing matters. Circumstances beyond your control matter. The promise of integration is not that you'll get everything you want. The promise is that you'll be able to navigate whatever happens with clarity, resilience, and integrity. You'll be able to pursue your goals effectively while maintaining your values. You'll be able to handle both success and failure without losing yourself. You'll be able to build genuine connections with others while protecting yourself from exploitation. This might not sound as exciting as a promise of guaranteed success, but it's more valuable. Because success without integration is hollow. You get what you wanted, but you lose yourself in the process. You win the game, but you don't know who won, because you've become someone you don't recognize. Integration allows you to pursue success while remaining yourself, to play the game while maintaining your humanity, to see clearly while keeping your heart open. So where does this leave us? We started with the observation that good people lose because they don't know the game. We've explored what the game is, how it works, why good people are particularly vulnerable to it. We've examined the journey from naive goodness to strategic integrity, from unconscious patterns to conscious choice. We've looked at the masks we wear, the shadows we deny, the systems we operate within. We've distinguished between manipulation and strategic authenticity, between power over and power to, between external validation and internal stability. But knowledge alone is not transformation. You can understand everything we've discussed and still find yourself falling into the same patterns, still being exploited by those who play the game unconsciously, still losing while telling yourself that at least you have your integrity. Understanding is necessary but not sufficient. What's required is practice, the daily work of noticing your patterns, catching yourself in old behaviors, choosing differently even when it's uncomfortable. It's the work of setting boundaries and tolerating the discomfort when people push back. It's the work of advocating for yourself even when your inner voice says you're being selfish. It's the work of staying present to your shadow, acknowledging your ambition and anger and self-interest without being ruled by them. This work is never finished. Integration is not a destination you arrive at, but a practice you maintain. You'll have moments of clarity and moments of confusion. You'll have times when you play the game skillfully and times when you fall back into old patterns. You'll have relationships where you maintain your boundaries beautifully and relationships where you lose yourself completely. This is normal. This is human. The goal is not perfection but direction. Not to never make mistakes but to learn from them. Not to always get it right, but to keep choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, clarity over confusion, integrity over convenience. And as you do this work, as you develop these skills and integrate these insights, something interesting happens. You start to see other people differently. You develop compassion for the Marcus types, recognizing that their manipulation comes from their own wounds and insecurities. You develop patience with the naive good people, remembering that you were once there too. You develop appreciation for the few people who are also doing this work of integration, who are also trying to navigate the game with consciousness and integrity. These people become your tribe, your fellow travelers on this path. You recognize each other not through what you say, but through how you are, through the quality of presence you bring, through the way you can be both strategic and authentic, both strong and vulnerable, both clear-eyed and open-hearted. These relationships, built on mutual recognition and respect, are different from the relationships you had before. They're not based on need or performance or strategic alliance. They're based on genuine seeing, on being known and accepted in your full complexity. They're relationships where you can take off your masks, where you can be strategic about the game while also being honest about the toll it takes, where you can celebrate your wins and process your losses without judgment. These relationships are rare and precious. They're one of the rewards of doing this work, of becoming someone who can see clearly and still choose connection. But even these relationships require maintenance, require consciousness, require the ongoing work of staying present and honest, and willing to repair when ruptures happen. Because no relationship, no matter how conscious, is immune to the patterns we've been discussing. Power dynamics exist in every relationship. Games get played, often unconsciously. Masks get worn. Shadows get projected. The difference is that in conscious relationships, these things can be named and worked with rather than denied or avoided. You can say to your partner, "I notice I'm falling into my helper pattern. I'm making myself too available and starting to feel resentful." You can say to your colleague, "I feel like we're competing when we could be collaborating. Can we talk about how to shift this dynamic?" You can say to your friend, "I need to set a boundary here, and I'm scared you'll be hurt or angry, but I need to do it anyway." This kind of direct, honest communication is terrifying for most people. We've been taught that relationships should be easy, that if you have to talk about dynamics and patterns and boundaries, something must be wrong. But this is another illusion, another way the game stays invisible. Healthy relationships require ongoing negotiation, ongoing communication, ongoing willingness to address what's not working. The relationships that look effortless from the outside are usually either very new, before the patterns have had time to emerge, or very conscious, where the work of maintenance has become so practiced that it looks natural. The integrated person understands this. They don't expect relationships to be easy. They expect them to be real, which means they'll be complex and sometimes difficult. They're willing to have the hard conversations, to name the dynamics, to work through the conflicts. They know that avoiding these conversations doesn't make the problems go away. It just makes them unconscious, which means they'll play out in more destructive ways. Better to bring things into the light, to talk about them directly, to work with them consciously than to let them fester in the shadows. This applies not just to personal relationships, but to all the systems and contexts you operate within. If you're in an organization with a toxic culture, you have choices. You can leave, which is sometimes the right choice. You can stay and adapt, learning to navigate the toxicity while protecting yourself. Or you can stay and try to change it, using your influence to shift the culture in a healthier direction. None of these choices is inherently right or wrong. The right choice depends on your circumstances, your values, your capacity, your goals. The key is to make the choice consciously, with full awareness of what you're doing and why, rather than defaulting to unconscious patterns of either martyrdom or complicity. The integrated person takes responsibility for their choices. They don't blame the system or other people for their situation. They recognize that while they can't control everything, they always have some degree of choice in how they respond. This is not about toxic positivity or pretending that systemic injustices don't exist. It's about recognizing your agency within whatever constraints you're operating under. You might not be able to change the system, but you can choose how you engage with it. You might not be able to control how others treat you, but you can choose how you respond and what you'll tolerate. You might not be able to avoid the game, but you can choose how you play it. This sense of agency, of being the author of your own life, rather than a victim of circumstances, is perhaps the most important outcome of integration. It's what allows you to move through the world with confidence and clarity, knowing that whatever happens, you'll be able to handle it. Not because you're invulnerable or because nothing bad will ever happen to you, but because you trust yourself to respond effectively, to learn from challenges, to adapt and grow and maintain your integrity through whatever comes. And this brings us to the final insight, the one that ties everything together, the game we've been discussing, the invisible rules and power dynamics and strategic interactions. All of this is ultimately about fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being abandoned, fear of being ordinary, fear of being seen as weak or foolish or unworthy. The people who play the game unconsciously, who manipulate and exploit and take advantage, they're driven by fear. The good people who lose, who sacrifice themselves and accept exploitation and never advocate for themselves, they're also driven by fear. Different fears, perhaps, but fear nonetheless. Marcus takes credit for Sarah's work because he's afraid that his own contributions aren't enough, that if he doesn't constantly prove his value, he'll be exposed as mediocre. Sarah doesn't speak up because she's afraid of being seen as difficult, of losing the approval and acceptance she's worked so hard to earn. David erases himself in his relationship because he's afraid that if Jennifer sees who he really is, with all his needs and flaws and limitations, she'll leave. Jennifer pulls away because she's afraid of being trapped, of losing herself in a relationship the way she's seen other women do. Robert protects himself by managing the narrative because he's afraid of failure, of being seen as incompetent, of losing the status and security he's built. All of these fears are understandable. They're human. They're based on real experiences of rejection, failure, and loss. But they're also, in most cases, disproportionate to the actual threat. The catastrophe we're afraid of, being abandoned, being exposed, being rejected, is rarely as catastrophic as we imagine. And even when it is, even when the worst happens, we're usually more resilient than we think. We survive. We adapt. We rebuild. The fear is often worse than the reality. Integration, then, is ultimately about developing a different relationship with fear, not eliminating it, which is impossible and probably undesirable. Fear is useful information. It tells us when we're at risk, when we need to be careful, when we're pushing beyond our comfort zone. But fear shouldn't be in charge. It shouldn't be making our decisions. The integrated person feels fear and acts anyway. They notice the fear, acknowledge it, thank it for trying to protect them, and then choose their response based on their values and goals rather than on the fear's demands. This is courage, but not the Hollywood version where you're never afraid. Real courage is being afraid and doing the thing anyway. It's Sarah speaking up when Marcus takes credit, even though her voice is shaking and her heart is pounding. It's David maintaining his boundaries with Jennifer, even though he's terrified she'll leave. It's Robert being honest about his mistakes, even though he's afraid of the consequences. It's choosing integrity over safety, truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, again and again, in small moments and large ones, until it becomes not easy but familiar, not natural but practiced. And here's what happens when you do this consistently. When you feel the fear and act with integrity anyway, the fear starts to lose its power, not because the risks disappear, but because you develop evidence that you can handle them. You speak up and the catastrophe you imagine doesn't happen. Or it does happen. You face consequences and you discover you can survive them. You set a boundary and some people respect it and some people push back, and you learn to distinguish between the two. You advocate for yourself and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and you learn that both are survivable, that your worth is not determined by any single outcome. This is the real transformation, the shift from being controlled by fear to being informed by it. And it changes everything. You move through the world differently. You make different choices. You build different relationships. You create a different life. Not necessarily a life that looks more successful from the outside, though it often does, but definitely a life that feels more authentic, more aligned, more yours. A life where you're the protagonist rather than the supporting character, where you're playing your own game rather than unconsciously playing someone else's. La historia continua, but let's not end on a note of individual transformation alone, as if this were just about personal development and self-improvement. Because the game we've been discussing is not just individual. It's collective. It's cultural. It's systemic. And while individual integration is necessary, it's not sufficient to change the larger patterns that make the game necessary in the first place. We need to talk about what it means to play the game while also working to change it, to succeed within the system while also questioning and challenging the system itself. This is perhaps the most complex ethical territory we've explored, because once you understand the game, once you develop the skills to play it effectively, you face a choice. Do you simply use these skills to advance your own interests, to win within the existing system? Or do you use them to try to change the system, to create conditions where the game is less necessary, where goodness and effectiveness are less at odds? The first path is easier and more immediately rewarding. The second path is harder and more uncertain, but it's also, arguably, more aligned with the values that made you a good person in the first place. Sarah's choice to build a different kind of company culture is an example of this. She could have simply used her understanding of the game to advance in a traditional corporate environment, playing the game better than everyone else and accumulating power and wealth. Instead, she chose to create a space where the game operates differently, where the rules reward collaboration and integrity rather than just self-promotion and strategic narrative. This doesn't mean she's eliminated the game. Human nature doesn't change just because you change the organizational structure. But she's created conditions where the game is more transparent, where the rules are more explicit, where success requires both competence and character rather than just one or the other. This is what we might call ethical leadership. Using your power and influence to create better systems, rather than just succeeding within existing ones. It's harder than it sounds. It requires you to resist the temptation to simply replicate the patterns that allowed you to succeed. It requires you to stay connected to the values that motivated you even as you accumulate power that could corrupt those values. It requires you to build systems that constrain your own power, that create accountability and transparency, that make it harder for you or anyone else to exploit the game in ways that harm others. Robert's choice to leave the corporate world and work with organizations that want to change is another version of this. He recognized that he couldn't change the system from within, at least not in the context he was in. So he created a different role for himself, one where he could use his strategic skills to help organizations become more conscious, more ethical, more aligned with values beyond just profit and growth. This is not a rejection of strategy or power. It's a redirection of them, using them in service of something larger than individual success. David's journey is less obviously about systemic change, but it's no less important. By learning to be in relationship without losing himself, by modeling what it looks like to maintain boundaries and advocate for needs while still being loving and connected, he's contributing to a cultural shift in how we think about relationships and masculinity. He's demonstrating that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, that you can be both assertive and caring, both independent and intimate. This might seem like a small thing, but culture changes through these individual examples, through people living differently and showing others that different ways of being are possible. This is the paradox of changing systems. You can't change them from outside. You have to be in them, have to understand them, have to develop the skills to navigate them effectively. But if you're not careful, the process of learning to navigate the system changes you in ways that make you less interested in changing it. You become invested in the system that's rewarding you. You start to rationalize its injustices. You tell yourself that this is just how the world works, that trying to change it is naive or idealistic. You become, in other words, part of the problem you once wanted to solve. This is why integration is so important. Without it, you either remain outside the system, pure but powerless, or you enter the system and get corrupted by it. Integration allows a third path, entering the system, developing power within it, and using that power to change it while maintaining your values and self-awareness. This is the path of the ethical game player, someone who understands the game well enough to win, but cares enough about something beyond winning to use their success in service of larger values. But let's be realistic about what this means. You're not going to single-handedly change capitalism or patriarchy or any of the other large systems that shape our lives. These systems are bigger than any individual, maintained by millions of people's choices and beliefs and behaviors. What you can do is create pockets of different possibility, spaces where the game operates differently, relationships and organizations and communities that embody different values. You can be an example of what's possible, showing others that you can be both strategic and ethical, both successful and humane, both clear-eyed about the game and committed to playing it with integrity. And you can support others who are doing the same work. This is crucial. The journey of integration is difficult and lonely if you're doing it alone. You need allies, fellow travelers, people who understand what you're trying to do and can support you when you're struggling. You need spaces where you can take off your masks, where you can talk honestly about the challenges of playing the game ethically, where you can process the moral complexity and emotional difficulty of this path. You need community, not the superficial networking kind, but the deep, authentic kind where people actually see and support each other. Building this kind of community is itself a form of systemic change, because the game persists partly through isolation, through everyone thinking they're the only one struggling with these questions, the only one trying to maintain integrity in systems that reward compromise. When you find others who are on the same path, when you create spaces for honest conversation about these challenges, you're creating an alternative culture, a different set of norms and values and expectations. You're showing that another way is possible, that you don't have to choose between being good and being effective, between having integrity and having power. This is the work of our time, individually and collectively, to see the game clearly, to develop the skills to play it effectively, and to use those skills in service of creating a world where the game is less necessary, where goodness and effectiveness are more aligned, where people can be authentic and strategic, vulnerable and strong, caring and boundaried. This is not a utopian vision. It's a practical one. It's about making incremental changes, creating small pockets of different possibility, supporting each other in the difficult work of integration and ethical action. And so we return to where we started, to the observation that good people lose because they don't know the game. But now we understand this statement differently. It's not that good people need to become game players in the cynical sense. It's that they need to develop consciousness, to see what's actually happening beneath the surface of social interaction, to understand the dynamics of power and influence and strategic behavior. They need to integrate their shadow, to acknowledge and develop the parts of themselves they've been taught to deny. They need to learn to be strategic without being manipulative, ambitious without being ruthless, self-interested without being selfish. This is not about abandoning goodness. It's about making goodness effective. It's about ensuring that your values can actually have impact in the world rather than just making you feel virtuous while you remain powerless. It's about becoming someone who can navigate complex social and organizational dynamics while maintaining integrity, who can protect themselves from exploitation while still being open to genuine connection, who can see the game clearly while still choosing to play it ethically. The journey from naive goodness to strategic integrity is not easy. It requires you to question everything you've been taught about virtue and success. It requires you to look at your own shadow, to acknowledge the parts of yourself you've been denying. It requires you to develop new skills that might feel uncomfortable or inauthentic at first. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood, of being seen as difficult when you're actually just being clear about your boundaries. It requires you to accept that you can't save everyone, that you're responsible for yourself and your choices, but not for others and theirs. But the rewards are worth it. You develop a sense of internal stability that's not dependent on external validation. You build relationships based on mutual respect rather than on need or performance. You create a life that's aligned with your values rather than shaped by others' expectations. You become someone who can handle both success and failure without losing yourself. You develop genuine power, not power over others, but power to create, to influence, to make a difference in ways that matter to you. And perhaps most importantly, you become free. Free from the need to perform, to please, to sacrifice yourself for others' approval. Free from the fear that drives so much of human behavior, the fear of not being enough, of being abandoned, of being exposed as inadequate. Free to be yourself, fully and authentically, with all your complexity and contradiction and humanity. Free to play the game on your own terms, with full awareness of what you're doing and why, choosing consciously rather than defaulting to unconscious patterns. This freedom is not the absence of constraints or challenges. You'll still face difficult situations, complex dynamics, people who try to manipulate or exploit you. But you'll face them differently, with clarity instead of confusion, with agency instead of victimhood, with strategic thinking instead of naive hope, with integrity instead of either blind virtue or a cynical self-interest. You'll face them as someone who knows who they are, what they value, and how to navigate the world effectively while maintaining their humanity. This is what it means to be a good person who wins. Not someone who's abandoned their values in pursuit of success, but someone who's developed the skills and consciousness to make their values effective in the world. Not someone who's become cynical and manipulative, but someone who's become strategic and authentic. Not someone who's stopped caring about others, but someone who's learned to care for themselves as well. Not someone who's given up on goodness, but someone who's made goodness powerful. The theater never closes. The stage is always there. The game continues in every interaction, every relationship, every organization and system we're part of. But now you see it. You understand the rules, the dynamics, the patterns. You know how to play. And more importantly, you know why you're playing, what you're playing for, what lines you won't cross. You're no longer unconsciously performing a role someone else wrote for you. You're consciously choosing your part, writing your own script, directing your own performance. And in that consciousness, in that choice, lies your power. Not the power to control everything, to win every interaction, to never face challenges or setbacks, but the power to respond effectively, to learn and adapt, to maintain your integrity through whatever comes. The power to be both strategic and authentic, both strong and vulnerable, both clear-eyed and open-hearted. The power to play the game without being consumed by it, to see the masks without losing your humanity, to understand the darkness without becoming dark yourself. This is the invitation, not to become someone you're not, but to become more fully who you are. Not to abandon your goodness, but to make it effective. Not to stop caring about others, but to learn to care for yourself as well. Not to become cynical about human nature, but to see it clearly, with all its complexity and contradiction, and to choose how you want to engage with it. Not to win at all costs, but to define winning on your own terms and to pursue it with both strategy and integrity. The curtain is rising. The next act is beginning. You know the game now. You see the masks. You understand the dynamics. The question is, how will you play? What role will you choose? What kind of character will you become? Not the naive good person who loses while feeling virtuous. Not the unconscious game player who wins while losing themselves, but the integrated person, the one who sees clearly and chooses consciously, who plays the game with both skill and integrity, who wins in ways that matter while maintaining their humanity. The stage is yours. The choice is yours. The game continues. But now, finally, you're playing it with your eyes open, your values intact, and your power fully claimed. Now you're not just a good person. You're a good person who knows the game. And that changes everything. And so, the curtain falls on this act. But the show continues, inside each of us, in the silence of our thoughts. The mask we've analyzed today, you may know it well. You may wear it. Or perhaps you see it in someone you love. The comment section below is not a place for judgment. It's our stage for confessions. A safe space for observers. Use that space to share your story. What mask did you have to wear to survive? We want to hear from you. And if you felt understood here, subscribe. Because here, you are not alone. Together, we'll keep unraveling human theater, one mask at a time. The next act is about to begin.